Good evening, freshers. I hope you're enjoying your orientation and getting habituated to your online college schedule. To give you a small break from it, we have a very enlightening session with an expert this evening. Coexisting in our society mostly depends on loving people for who they are and making sure everybody's included, regardless of their backgrounds, gender, and sexuality. We're going to extend the same practice for our campus, making it a very safe and inclusive environment for the LGBTQ plus community in it. To give us insights on how to do it, we have with us social entrepreneur, gender and sexuality thought leader, Dr. Pragati Singh. She is the founder of Indian Aces and Humans of Queer, and also Asexuality Asia, which are organizations spreading much required awareness on the queer community and providing support and representation to them. She has been honored by the BBC's 100 Women list in 2019 for a novel contribution to the sexual and reproductive health rights discourse in India and beyond. I can keep stating her accomplishments for the whole duration of the live, but I'm sure you would want to hear from the expert herself. We are delighted to have you here, ma'am.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. And I'm so happy to see that this initiative is being taken to make your campus a safer and a more accessible space for everybody.
We hope to have an insightful discussion with you, ma'am. Before we begin to get today's session, I'd like to inform you that the orientation magazine is finally live, guys. Make sure to check it out in the description box. Let's move on to the questions now. Ma'am, why do you think it's important to not generalize gender terms to the binaries?
This is probably a very basic question. And if I respond it in the same way, it'll probably not make sense. But this is a larger concept that goes beyond just gender. Let's think about the variation that exists in people regardless of gender. Okay, like we accept people and we acknowledge them and we respect them for the different states they come from, different religious backgrounds, their different heights, their different skin colors, and we take into consideration how to make the space a little safer, taking into consideration all these quote unquote natural variations that exist in humans. Similarly, gender is just one more aspect of a person that can vary between different people. And while for the longest time we have thought of gender as a binary, um, later thinking of it as at least a spectrum that exists between two polar ends, now we've realized that it's not even like that. It can function in very, very different ways. It's at least a two-dimensional sheet on which you can belong on any particular point, if not a three-dimensional structure, which is even more complex. So I think it's important to know that while for many people, being addressed as a he or a she based on your apparent understanding of genders is not necessarily traumatic. For some people, it really can be. There's a concept called gender dysphoria, which means you have strong feelings of discomfort with assigned genders, which includes he, she labels, includes labels such as man and woman, and so on and so forth. So it's important to be considerate to this one more thing as well while we're trying to make our campuses safer, just as we do for other criteria, such as the ones that I mentioned earlier.
That's insightful, ma'am. So it's about making every aspect of it included and not to leave any kind of people out. Moving on to the next question. What are pronouns? How to understand pronouns and adapt to different pronouns in the campus?
Right. So pronouns are pretty much very, very closely related to gender that we spoke about in the first question. And pronoun is basically something that you use to address a person when you're not using their names, right? It's a simple understanding. Like, for example, the most easily understood pronouns in the English language, for example, have always been he and she. It has been assumed that you use he for everybody who looks like a man, and you assume that you use she for everybody who looks like a woman. However, pronouns can be more complex than that, just as gender actually is. There are many people who do not want to identify with either of these two pronouns. And in a larger sense, as a blanket rule, at any point of time, unless you really want to genderize a person, simply use the pronoun they. It is inclusive, it is all encompassing, and it is very neutral. It is typically not seen as problematic and typically does not cause anybody any discomfort and will always leave you on the safer side. And then, if you really need to know somebody's pronouns, the best way is to ask them for that. And once you've asked them, they will typically give you an answer, which you can then go on with for the rest of the conversation. So, for example, if I'm supposed to address you, Mridul, I can either assume, because of how I have understood gender for all of my life, that your pronoun could be or should be he. It would not necessarily be right on my part unless I have asked you or confirmed with you, or you have informed me that you prefer that pronoun. So, in those cases, I think it is best to slide in that question at the beginning of a conversation and be sure. And if you feel like that is not a conversation that you're possibly going to be able to have in that moment, simply use the pronoun they and go on with your conversation. So that would be my one tip to all people, to go with they, to just be on the safer side most of the times.
That's a sensible habit to follow, ma'am. We'll move on to the next question. Do you have any pointers as what not to do as an LGBTQ plus ally?
What not to do? Well, don't speak for the queer community. Typically, an ally has a better understanding of the queer community than a non ally, but they still don't have the full, deep, complex, lived experience that a queer person has had for 18, 19, 17, 20 years of their lives, right? And so, one of the things that I have seen allies try to do a lot is that, because of their well-intentioned idea that they want to do something for the queer community or the LGBTQ community, they try to often take that space and be more vocal and be more verbal than the LGBTQ people themselves. And while in some places this could be a great strategy to create that space in the beginning, in most cases, I would say, if you're trying to be a better ally, create that space for the queer person themselves to come and speak for themselves, right? Instead of you holding that space and speaking on behalf of them. Because while you might have read a lot about it, you might have a few friends as well from the community, you might have interacted, organized events, you still will lack the lived experience and the nuances and the understanding and the insight that comes from that. And so you don't want to be that person who takes up space and says something that a queer person sitting right next to you will be like, no, that's not true. That's not true for us. And then, I mean, that's an awkward place for you to be in as well. So number one tip to be a better ally is to give space to the person who needs that space instead of yourself. And as an ally, perhaps you are in a better position to create that space for them instead. So that would be my number one tip of what to do and what not to do. The second one would be, again, as an ally, sometimes your understanding of different LGBTQIA terms, concepts, categories, and communities will be very, how do I say it, very neatly packed, right? And the truth is that for most queer people, if not all, their lives are actually more messy than that. It's not very neatly fitting into one box or two boxes the way that an ally sees it typically, right? So another thing to keep in mind while you're trying to be a better ally is to know that LGBTQI people are not very, it's not a checklist as such. That's not how people's lives roll out in front of them. It's not how people's lives have unfolded for them. So while you might think that for a lesbian, for example, this is what being a lesbian means, is also true that you might come across a queer person who identifies as lesbian who's very different from what you read about or what you saw in your 2-3 years of being an ally. So have that sensitivity and leave that margin and that space for people to tell you that your understanding of any particular term, any particular concept in the LGBTQIA is limited, and there are various complex overlapping places within the queer spectrum, and many people lie in those overlaps, and it doesn't really look very neatly divided there.
So the idea should be providing them the space without invalidating their experiences.
Of course.
Yes, ma'am. We'll move on to the next section, which is busting myths and stigma surrounding different sexual and gender orientations. We'll have the first one. You have not had sex. How would you know? This is a very common comment on asexual people. Your thoughts on this, ma'am?
Right. So there are a few ways to think about it. One way is the cheeky way, which is my favorite way, right? So let me just put you through that idea and see if you like it as well. So when somebody says that, hey, you can't be asexual unless you've tried sex, because what if you have sex and you like it, and then you realize that you're not asexual? That's basically their chain of thought, right? When they're saying this. Now, in response to that, you can say something like, let's say this is a straight man saying this to you, just an example, a hypothetical situation. You can come back to that straight person and say, have you had gay sex? Like they think gay sex means having a man having sex with another man. But anyway, so have you had gay sex? Have you had sex with another man? And if they say no, you can be like, what if you're gay, but you just haven't realized it because you haven't had sex with them yet? Right? And so on and so forth. If you put them in that logical container, typically it is very easy or very quick for them to be able to understand where their fallacy was. They'll understand it quickly enough. For many, of course, it might still not work. But in my experience, I have used this plenty. I have used this a lot. For personal situations, for professional situations, whenever I'm asked this question, I very often use this, and I would say the success rate is somewhere between 90 to 95%, and I'm fairly happy with that. So I would say that this is a common comment that you will get if you tell people that you're asexual, and my advice would be to use this little example.
That's a very smart way to handle this one. We'll move on to the next one. Talking to homosexual people make you homosexual or queer for this state. This is
Right. So
another
I
point of
have
view which some people even hold today. Your response to that one?
Right. I am actually quite surprised to see this because I have never come across anybody saying this. To me, it seems extremely, I don't know. I don't know how these people are thinking when they're saying something like that. It's completely unrelatable to me personally. But do you have any elaborations, Mridul, on why somebody is saying that? And maybe then I can tell you how to debunk it.
We just had the assumption that every we have to take in consideration of all levels of awareness people have on this. So thinking of that, we might have heard this from, I'm not sure, really old people, I guess. We
Okay.
just had to take this in
Right.
consideration because we have to
Sure,
consider
sure.
all kinds of awareness which people have.
All right. So again, I am able to think of one cheeky response. So I'll give you that cheeky response, but I'll also give you another a little more scientific way to think about it, perhaps. The cheeky response would be if somebody says that to me, and if I feel like they're saying it in a condescending manner, maybe I'll say, why don't you then go hang out with intelligent people, because then maybe you will become intelligent too, and not say things like this. That is, I think, one response that I could give, and something that you could use too. But in a more scientific manner, what I could say is that typically there are research papers that have claimed, with good reason, that if this world was more queer friendly, there would be more people identifying as queer. you know and of course, this, in one way, you can understand that there would be more people coming out as queer, but that's not what this paper says. This paper says that more people who currently don't identify as queer would have identified as queer. Now, what that means is that a lot of what we identify ourselves with comes from how we perceive the concept in itself, right? And so it is possible that if this world was queer friendly and more people spoke about queer issues, and if it was just a little more accepting, more people would have identified as queer. And then what's the problem with that, right? The other thing is, the other way that you can think about it is the fact that typically this won't be a queer person saying this kind of a thing, and you can invite them and you can be like, okay, we challenge you to remain straight or remain non-queer, and hang out with us queer people, and let's see who wins, and see if that game pans out. And it could be like a inter-college, inter-year, inter-semester kind of a contest, and you can see if the straight people can be converted into queer by just talking to queer people. I find it ridiculous, of course.
I'm personally enjoying your responses now. Moving on to the next one. Who are the guy and the girl in the relationship? Can you explain the detriments of viewing relationships like this in a very heteronormative sense?
Mm. Of course, there's a lot of problem there, but I also want you to think about the fact that for a vast majority of people, we come from cultures and contexts and decades worth of conditioning, right? Before we probably going to come across a queer person for the first time, or open up to a queer person, or be in the company of many queer people or the queer community, typically in our country. Typically it takes typically the typical straight cis het person is at least in their teens before they really start to engage in a healthy manner with another queer person. Before that, you don't really have that understanding. And all of the conditioning that you've had for those very formative, most morally crucial years of your life have ended up telling you that there is always a girl and a guy equation. So while we can obviously take digs at people who are, like I have been doing in this interview as well, at people who don't know better or who say ignorant things, we also need to be constantly aware and sensitive to the fact that it's going to take a long time for people to unlearn things also. And it at more points than not, it will become imperative that you're patient with them. Right? There's a famous quote that I heard somewhere, that if you've taken 100 steps into a forest, you can't get out in 10 steps. You'll have to take 100 steps back also to get out of the forest, right? So if somebody has spent so much time, so much of their lives learning that there's always a man and a woman in a relationship, or that's the only dynamic in a relationship, it is understandable why they apply that template even to a quote unquote lesbian relationship or a gay relationship. You know what I mean? And while we can allow people to take that time to unlearn, it is also important for these people who know that they have been conditioned to take that onus and take that responsibility of doing the unlearning. So it has to be a both way process. And of course, it is detrimental. I don't think I need to tell anybody why it's detrimental. Many people will understand that in many lesbian, gay, other kinds of relationships as well, there is no quote unquote man and a quote unquote woman, or there are no such roles assigned. Even though there might be in some, it is not a necessity in all relationships, is the point. So I think it's a give and take, and there's a little back and forth that needs to happen between people who've been conditioned for so long, and now need to take up the task of unconditioning themselves and relearning the truths of today's world, and also a little patience on the part of people who are queer and face these kinds of ignorant statements on a daily basis, maybe.
Yes, ma'am. I've personally had experience unlearning a few things that I was conditioned with. And I can say that my queer friends were really patient with me when I was having that. Moving on to the next one. Pick a side. Yet another homophobic comment on bisexual or pansexual people. Your thoughts on this, ma'am?
Yeah, this is actually, I think this is something that a lot of bisexual people get a lot. This is very common. Of course, it also has corollaries such as a bisexual person is just confused, or a bisexual person is just typically homosexual, but they're just not letting that out and they're not coming out of the closet. That's why they're calling themselves bisexual. But think about it like this: typically, you're basing your orientation or your understanding of your orientation based on what you realize you see as a sexually attractive gender, typically, right? It's not like you decided. It's not like you sat down and said that I'm going to decide that I'm going to be attracted to women, or I'm going to decide that from today on I'm going to feel attracted only towards men. That's not how it happens. Typically, somewhere in your teenage, you're just like, oh, I guess this is how I feel. It's something you discover about yourself. You don't manufacture it. And so, why is it necessarily so hard for people to understand that for some reason, this is still scientifically largely unknown why or how it happens, but for some reason, just as you were discovering that, oh, I guess I'm attracted to men, somebody else might have realized that, oh, I guess I'm attracted to X and Y and Z gender, you know, a variety of genders or any kind of combination, permutation, combination, just men and women if you want to keep it simple, if that's how you want to think of bisexuality. So it's not really that difficult to understand. It's about who you found yourself able to see sexually, typically, right? And if you found yourself, for whatever reason, at the age of 15, finding both your female classmates and your male classmates attractive, then what are you supposed to do? Why are you supposed to pick a side? How is that logically making sense? And of course, now we know that bisexuality is not limited anymore to men and women only. We know now that one, gender is more complex than that, and two, bisexuality has been the definition has been reformed to include all people who are attracted to more than one genders, right? So, so think about it, like really, and for anybody who has that kind of a thought that, hey, a bisexual person should just pick a side and go with one side. Think about it like this. Let's say you are attracted to women, okay? Let's say, and you're attracted to women who are short and cute, and you're also attracted to women who are tall and slim. Just a random example. Does it make sense if somebody says just pick one for the rest of your life, only be attracted to short women for the rest of your life, or only be attracted to tall women for the rest of your life? Does it make sense to have somebody else tell you that, hey, that's weird that you're attracted to both tall women and short women? You can only be attracted to one of those two. Logically, it doesn't make sense. You found yourself feeling attracted to short women also at some point, and tall women also. And so for the rest of your life, why can't you simply be allowed to experience that attraction to both, right? So see it like that, and maybe that helps.
I think the imperative here is to consider the fact that it's not something they choose to do. We'll move on to the next one. What gender were you before? Can you explain how offensive is this to ask to trans people and why?
Right. So again, I don't want to speak on behalf of trans people, but in my experience of working with queer communities at large, as well as trans people, here's what a trans person is going to see or hear when you pose this question to them. Let's say I'm a trans person, and let's say that I'm a trans woman. You see me as a woman now. The world saw me as a boy when I was growing up, but I have always seen myself as a woman and as a girl. You see what I'm trying to say? That if I'm a trans woman and you are seeing me as a woman now, all my childhood pictures look like a boy's. That is exactly where my discomfort was. The fact that I was seen as a boy, the fact that when I saw the mirror, I couldn't relate to what I was seeing in the mirror, right? And so when you pose this kind of a question, what gender were you before? Typically, what a trans person is going to think is that I have always been a woman. I have always been a girl. It's just that I wasn't allowed to express that gender the way that, because of the way that the world works. So when you're saying that, you're basically asking them to, one, go back into their gender dysphoria that they've taken decades to come out of. Um, it's also an attack on the fact that you still don't acknowledge the fact that even though now maybe they've gone through the entire process, maybe they've gone through a surgery, a medical procedure, now they've legally got their name changed, maybe they've started dressing up as an independent person, they've started dressing up the way they want to. Despite all of those efforts, you're still not able to see them as what they're trying so hard to let the world know they are, right? So I think uh, um, these are definitely two of the things that will happen if you say something like that to a trans person. I'm sure that there's more complexity to it as well, but this is what I will limit it to right now.
I think that's a clear view on how they would feel, which most of them would not have been aware of before. We'll move on to our last myth, which is you don't look gay though. This is another opinion about stereotyping queer people based on looks.
Yes, absolutely. And this again is a very, very common one. You don't look gay, you don't look lesbian, you don't look asexual, all sorts of things. And I think again, it boils down to a lot of the things that we discussed earlier, which is the classic conditioning that we've had for all of our lives, which is that um, everybody has to have a certain way of looking like a man and a way of looking like a woman, and a gay man will have some effeminate characteristics. That is something very ingrained in us. Now it is up to us to think about where did it come from, because when you think of it, gay, the word in itself, does not have any conceptual connotations to being effeminate at all. It just means a man who's attracted to another man. Now think about it, where does it come from that a gay person has to look a certain way? And when you think about it, you'll probably realize that it comes from very, very poor, caricaturized media representations that you've consumed all through your life growing up. Those Bollywood movies where a gay person is typically used as a prop to provide some kind of an entertainment value to the film, as a joke, as a caricature, as something to be laughed upon, or all of those magazines where a typical way of being gay has been portrayed as the right way of being gay, and maybe that's where you get it from, right? So while it is true that many gay people are able to wear the kinds of clothes that they want to. Now, okay, this is something interesting that I don't know, maybe people will be able to relate to. What I want to convey here is that I know friends of mine who are very straight, very cis. These are men. And they often tell me that I would love to wear a floral shirt, but I don't think I can, because if I do, I'll be typecast into some kind of a person. Similarly, about wearing the color pink, which looks beautiful on some men, but they won't wear it because then they feel they will be typecast into looking a certain way or dressing up in a color which is associated so strongly with femininity. The reason why many gay men are able to wear pink and floral prints is because they just don't give a heck anymore. They've moved beyond that point. They have bigger problems that people socially stigmatize them for, and they're like, wearing the kind of shirt that I want to, or looking the way that I want to, is not the biggest problem that I have right now, right? So it's an interesting, I think, anecdote that people can also think about in their own circles. The kinds of dressing choices that men make are more restricted than they would like, and this is something that I hope the men in the audience can agree with and secretly tell their female friends at a later point of time and confide in them. But the entire concept of looking a certain way to prove that you are gay, or the other way around, that if you look a certain way, you must be gay. Both of those are so incorrect. It's like, think of it like a Venn diagram, right? Like in a Venn diagram, there are people who look or act or dress in a way that you think is effeminate. Then there are some people who are, this other circle is people who identify as gay. Now, there is obviously an overlap between these two circles in the Venn diagram, right? I hope everybody here knows what a Venn diagram is. In that overlap are the people who are gay and dress up in that stereotypical way that you think is associated with being gay. But that's not always true. On the left side, there will be a part of that circle will be people who dress up in a way which you think is effeminate. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're gay. They're not. And then on the right side of this diagram, there will be people who are gay, but they don't dress up that way because they just don't like to. That's not their aesthetic. Right. So you have to be able to see these things as a little more complex than black and whites. That a person who's gay is just naturally attracted or inclined to dress up a certain way or act a certain way or behave a certain way is an absolute false statement. That is not true for many, if not all people. And similarly, the other way around as well.
That's very insightful, ma'am. Let's move on to a few more questions. You're among the very few people to have focused your work on asexuality, which has quite some stigma around it, and people largely failing to gather awareness on it. Can you elaborate on some of your work, spreading awareness to us in the process?
Well, my work started in 2014, so I've been doing this for a long time now. Of course, the pandemic has changed a lot of things, but before that, we were doing a lot of offline workshops, trainings, meetups, community building activities, awareness sessions, sensitization sessions, not just asexuality, but also everything else which forms the larger gender and sexuality umbrella, because everything is quite intertwined. Even though my niche and my focus area remains asexuality till date, we have to capture all of these allied subjects as well to make it to make sure that it makes sense to the person who's receiving it. So one of the things that we're doing now is we're writing a book called Asexual Lives. The first manuscript of which is going to be out somewhere in May, and then hopefully it will be published within the year. That's what we're hoping for. It will again be the first book to come out of India on the topic, so I'm quite looking forward to it. The other thing that I think a lot of people could use is this podcast that I've recently launched. It's called Getting Intimate with Dr. Pragati Singh, where we talk about the largely stigmatized issues, the more complex issues around gender and sexuality, as well as mental health.
That's very interesting, ma'am. We want the book to roll out so we can all check it out. I think we can move on to some audience questions now. Okay, we have a question from Aishwarya. When we see a queer couple being publicly harassed, how do we stand by them as allies or members of the community?
Mm, okay. When we see a queer couple being publicly harassed, okay. Um, I'm not sure about the legality of this in completion, but what I do know is that harassment of any kind is typically not tolerable. Um, I don't know necessarily what it is that you can definitely do, but as a typical standbyer's understanding of what to do when you see anybody being harassed is that first you need to make sure that you're in a position where you will be safe when you try to stand by. Otherwise, it makes one more victim, nothing else. So you have to first ensure your safety in the sense that you have to either make sure that you call up a few of your friends to help you with or support you with this entire process. The second thing is typically to attract attention to what is happening. Right. So if you see that there are people being harassed, and typically if there's a queer couple being harassed, it's the same kind of harassment that happens towards women typically. You need to draw people's or crowds' attention towards the fact that this is happening. More often than not, it is very difficult for the person being harassed to voice it out, to loudly to make a noise about it and to claim the fact that they're being harassed. Typically, they will find it difficult to do that. They will be shut down. They will want to avert the gaze instead of getting any attention on it. But one of the things that you can do as a bystander is to bring attention, to either create a noise, to bring people's attention. If there's security guards, any police personnel, bring it to their attention quickly and try to track as much gaze onto that event that is happening. And very often, if not always, harassers can get discouraged by that, even though that is not a foolproof method. Of course, there are still going to be cases where, despite public acknowledgement of the fact that this is happening, the harassers might go on, in which case you might have to take a legal recourse and call up something that is called the PCR van in Delhi. You might have your own systems.
I think we can all take away something from this and follow it from here on where we see any harassment going on in public or workspaces. This has been very enlightening, ma'am. The freshers would have had some unlearning about the stigma surrounding sexualities, genders, and the internalized homophobia. They would like to introspect us this more as rational thinkers after the talk is over. I'm sure everybody here got something to take away from the talk today and would be looking forward to putting these pointers to practice in everyday spaces when they arrive on campus. And
Sure. Thank you. It's been a pleasure for me as well, Mridul. And of course, I will be available for anybody who wants to ask me any questions or get in touch later as well. Feel free to catch up with me on social media, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you for having me.
yes, freshers, before we end the session, make sure to fill out the form in the chat box to interact with Pragati ma'am, ask her doubts, and receive updates about her handle from her handles. Thank you.
Thank you.